Hey guys, tonight we settle in for something icy, bleak, and maybe a little too real, because medieval winters weren't just chilly, they were survival gauntlets where the cold crept through your bones like an unwelcome roommate who never paid rent. Picture it now, you shuffle awake inside a thatched hut, the walls sweating with frost, your breath puffing into tiny white clouds in front of your face. The rooster outside, yeah, he's frozen quiet, because even poultry knows better than to waste energy in this weather. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, at least you'll get a good bedtime story out of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. I always find it fun to imagine this channel as one long, cozy night across different time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The door to your hut creaks open, and there it is, the medieval village, cloaked in a sheet of biting frost. The sun is just a pale smear over the horizon, more decorative than useful, and every step you take crunches against a ground so hard it feels like you're walking on hammered iron. Winters in the Middle Ages weren't the snow globe kind we like to romanticize today. They were long stretches of bitter endurance, where every morning meant another day of fighting the cold. You tug your woolen cloak tighter around you, but the chill slides in anyway, needling your skin. A mainstream fact to anchor us here: winter temperatures in Europe during the so-called Little Ice Age could plunge well below freezing for weeks at a time. People weren't strolling around in chic coats. They were stuffing themselves into whatever layers and wool, leather, or fur they could scrape together. And even then, frostbite wasn't uncommon. Fingers, toes, and noses became daily sacrifices to the icy air. The quirky bit: some peasants believed that carrying an onion in your pocket would keep you warm. Don't laugh. You've definitely carried stranger things in your pockets. Imagine it now. You shuffle along, bundled in a cloak, with a pungent onion bulge by your hip smelling like a walking stew. The logic: onions were hot foods in medieval humoral theory, supposedly countering the cold temperament of winter. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies were taken seriously by everyone or if some medieval neighbours were already rolling their eyes at the onion carriers. The landscape around you doesn't help. The village is hushed, not because people are sleeping, but because sound itself seems muffled under the heavy frost. Smoke curls out of the few chimneys that still have fuel to burn, and the air stings like pepper when you breathe. Even your shadow seems sluggish, stretching across snow that reflects more cold than light. You pass a neighbour, bent double under a bundle of sticks strapped to their back. That's the day's work right there, collecting enough fuel to keep a fire alive until night. Wood was scarce, and most forests were tightly controlled by lords who didn't appreciate peasants sneaking in to cut down trees. Poaching a rabbit could get you fined, stealing a log could get you beaten. So your neighbour scrounges for scraps, twigs, anything combustible. In times like these, even dried animal dung was fair game. Cow pies weren't just farm waste, they were winter fuel. Another reality check: the ground is so frozen that farming halts completely. Crops? Forget it. Fields lie bare and crusted with ice. You won't be pulling up carrots in January. What you eat is what you manage to stash in autumn. And if your stash runs low, well, you start getting creative. By creative, I mean you look at your neighbour's onion bulge and wonder if he's guarding a feast. You trudge toward the edge of the village, where the communal well stands like a block of stone. A few villagers are hacking at the frozen surface with iron rods, the clang ringing out in the still air. Water was a chore in winter, not flowing freely from taps but trapped under layers of ice. Fetching it meant sore arms and endless patience. And when you finally filled your bucket, half of it sloshed away in the form of icy shards before you even got back home. The children of the village, they scamper barefoot across the snow like tiny frost demons, their giggles carried on the air. You wonder how their toes don't fall off. But here's the joke: maybe they just didn't feel them anymore. Kids were surprisingly resilient, and besides, footwear wasn't always an option for poor families. The medieval slipper was sometimes just thick straw stuffed into leather shoes, or nothing at all. You think about your fluffy socks at home, and suddenly you feel spoiled. There's another sound in the distance, a low moan of wind curling through the valley. It whips against the thatch, rattles loose shutters, and feels like a reminder that nature, in this time, isn't some beautiful postcard. It's a predator that never sleeps. The villagers live at its mercy, their survival hanging by a thread woven from sheer grit, communal sharing, and the occasional onion charm. As the day trudges forward, you realize that winter here isn't a season. It's a siege. The snow and frost have stormed in, and now they squat over the land, uninvited, unrelenting. And you're just one of the shivering defenders, teeth chattering in a hut that feels smaller and smaller each time the wind presses against it. But the thing about medieval folk, about you now in this frozen village, is that they always find a way to endure. Because tonight, as another icy dusk creeps closer, you know you'll crawl back under furs and scratchy blankets, huddled together for warmth. And you'll dream not of snow globes or cozy firesides, but simply of spring, of thawed fields, of sun that actually matters. Until then, every morning is the same. You open your eyes, see your breath, and remind yourself you made it through one more night. The day drags on, and the hunger gnaws at your belly like a persistent mouse that refuses to leave the pantry. But more pressing than food is the cold, the kind that seeps in no matter how many cloaks or furs you stack on your shoulders. You glance at the fire pit in the center of your hut. A few dull embers glow, but they're fading, and you know you'll need to feed them soon or risk the frost creeping inside like an intruder. Fuel, you quickly learn, is more precious than gold in a medieval winter. You step outside again, cloak pulled high over your nose. The air slices at your cheeks like knives dipped in snowmelt. People shuffle past with bundles of sticks, bits of dried peat, and baskets of brambles, their faces grim. Firewood isn't a luxury, it's life itself, a mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, wood shortages in parts of Europe were so severe that laws restricted who could chop in the Lord's forest. It wasn't just about trees, it was about survival hierarchy. Nobles warmed their halls with roaring fires while peasants scratched together twigs like desperate squirrels. Here comes the quirky bit. Peat, those squishy bricks cut from marshlands, became a lifesaver in many regions. You trudge with a villager to the edge of the bog, where blocks of dark, sodden earth are hacked up, dried and stacked like treasure. Sure, when you toss it into a fire, it smoulders more than blazes, filling your hut with a perfume best described as earthy swamp candle. But when your toes threaten to detach from your feet, smoky peat smells like paradise. Historians still argue whether peat fueled enough households to ease wood shortages, or if it was more a regional fix than a widespread solution. Your journey for warmth is exhausting. You wander past a mother stooping to gather thorny brambles, her hands red and cracked from the cold. Her children follow, dragging. Little bundles behind them, their bodies too thin for this kind of weather. Firewood isn't just scarce, it's contested. Villagers sometimes fought over who had the right to cut a certain tree or gather from the common woods. And don't forget, if you're caught stealing from the Lord's forest, the punishment could be brutal. Fines, whippings, or even losing your right hand, which seems counterproductive considering you'd need that hand to keep gathering firewood. Inside your hut later, you nurse the fire like it's a fragile child. Every twig matters, every spark guarded. People learned tricks, stacking stones around the hearth to hold heat longer, banking embers under ash to keep them alive overnight. and cooking meals in clay pots that doubled as hand warmers. You might chuckle thinking of your microwave at home. Hit a button, boom, hot soup, here. It's an engineering project just to keep the stew lukewarm until sundown. Your neighbour swings by, shoulders slumped, carrying nothing but disappointment. He says the woods are stripped bare and even the hedges are snapped down to twigs. The rumour spreads. Someone's been sneaking into the forest at night. Suspicion grows. You can almost hear the whispering at the well. Did you see Hans with that bundle of oak? The cold not only bites skin, it bites trust. Survival becomes a group effort, but desperation turns neighbours into suspects. And still, the wind howls through the cracks. You stuff straw into the gaps in the walls, pack mud tighter, anything to keep the draft out. But it's like fighting an enemy that can't be killed. The warmth you make slips away, stolen into the night, and all you can do is chase it back with more fuel you barely have. There's a joke hidden in the misery. You imagine what medieval firewood hacks would look like if they had YouTube. Top 10 ways to stretch a log, number 7 will shock you. But in reality, there were tricks. Drying dung patties, weaving bundles of straw, even burning bones when things got desperate. Yes, actual bones. Nothing went to waste, not even Uncle Gerald's leftovers. As you huddle closer to the hearth, the flames crackling weakly, you realize that winter is a constant negotiation with fire. Too much fuel burned now, and you'll freeze tomorrow. Too little, and you'll freeze tonight. Every stick is a gamble, every ember a coin you can't afford to lose. And through it all, there's the smell. Thick, smoky, clinging to hair and clothes until it becomes your identity. You are not just a villager anymore. You are smoke, ash, and the faint outline of someone praying the fire doesn't die. The room darkens, the wind whistles outside, and you stretch your hands toward the fragile light. Firewood, more than bread or ale, feels like the currency of life itself. And with each flicker you realize, in the medieval winter economy, you are always one log away from ruin. The fire sputters behind you as the smell of smoke clings stubbornly to your hair, and your stomach growls like a hound that hasn't been fed in days. Food, that gnawing, ever-present thought, presses into every conversation in winter. You trudge across the village square, boots crunching on ice, and your eyes catch on the meagre loaves being passed around. They're not golden, fluffy, or remotely inviting. No, these are hard, dark bricks of barley bread stretched with husks and filler that scrape against your teeth like sand. Here's a solid historical fact. Wheat bread, the kind you probably picture when you think bread, was a luxury in much of medieval Europe, reserved for nobles, monasteries, and wealthy townsfolk. For peasants, barley, rye, and oats were the usual grains, often ground into coarse flour. And when harvests went poorly, those grains were extended with whatever people could find. Bean flour, acorns, even ground-up weeds. Imagine a great British Bake-Off episode where Paul Hollywood bites into a loaf and discovers it's 40% crushed nettles. He'd glare, mutter, absolutely roar, and walk off set. The quirky detail that might make you smile. Some loaves were padded with sawdust. Yes, you heard right, sawdust bread. Was it a culinary trend? Not exactly. It was desperation in dough form. Sawdust had fibre but no nutrition, which meant it filled stomachs but starved bodies. You take a bite of your coarse barley crust, feel it scrape down your throat and think, guess I'll take the onion pocket trick instead. Historians still argue whether famine-era fillers like sawdust were common or just isolated oddities passed down in cautionary tales. Either way, you don't want to be the unlucky taster. As you chew, the bread crumbles dryly, demanding water, or in your case ale, because water in medieval villages wasn't always the healthiest choice. Bread and ale weeds. Re-inseparable partners, the safe combo that got people through winter. The ale was weak, more liquid bread than buzz, but it softened the chew, making the barley brick a little more edible. You gulp it down, savouring the illusion of fullness as the liquid warms your throat. You glance at the village oven, a communal hearth where several households bring their dough to bake. The fire roars faintly inside, a rare beacon of warmth. Families huddle, waiting their turn, each clutching a small lump of dough like treasure. There's an unspoken competition here. Whose loaf looks fattest, whose is thinnest, who tried sneaking in extra flour from the last sack. You smirk at the idea of medieval great oven drama, complete with side eye and whispered gossip. The truth is, storing grain for winter was both art and gamble. Granaries weren't perfect. Rats, damp and mould often stole more food than people did. You imagine cracking open a barrel only to find half your oats chewed to dust, the culprits scampering away smugly fat. Villagers fought back with cats, traps and charms. Cats were loved for their rodent hunting skills, but also feared as possible witches' familiars. Talk about mixed job reviews. At home later, you try making a pottage, a thick stew of grains, water, maybe a carrot if you're lucky. The pot bubbles weakly over the fire, the smell earthy but plain. It fills bellies, but excitement? Not so much. Pottage was the go-to medieval dish, endlessly recycled, sometimes left simmering for days with new scraps tossed in. Congratulations, you've invented the world's first bottomless soup subscription. But famine still lurks in the shadows of your meal. You overhear whispers that some households are already thinning their flour with chalk. Others are boiling old bones for broth. It's not about taste anymore, it's about keeping something in your stomach, tricking your body into thinking it's nourished. And yet, life goes on. Children munch their dry crusts without complaint. Old men grumble that bread was better in their day. Sound familiar? And neighbours trade tips on which grains stick to the ribs longest. You can almost laugh because even in the bleakest winters, food became conversation, tradition, and the glue that held communities together. You glance down at your barley loaf. It's ugly, tough, and painfully dry, but it's survival in solid form. Every crumb represents a gamble taken months ago when seeds were sown. Every bite is a reminder that winter is a marathon of hunger, and bread is both your companion and your curse. Tomorrow the loaves will be thinner, harder, maybe mixed with something you'd rather not think about. But tonight you chew slowly, savouring even this rough crust, because in medieval winters, bread wasn't just food, it was the line between waking up tomorrow or not. You shift your weight on the rough bench, the dry bread still sitting like a stone in your belly, and pull your cloak tighter. But the fabric scratches your neck, and you notice the uncomfortable truth. Warmth and itch often came as a package deal in medieval winters. The cloak you're bundled in, heavy wool, thick and coarse, cut from sheep whose main contribution to fashion was beige. Sure, it blocks the wind, but it feels less like cosy clothing and more like wearing a carpet your grandma left in the barn. That's the reality. Clothing was survival gear, not a runway statement. A mainstream historical fact. Most peasants wore layered tunics of wool, linen undergarments if they could afford them, and patched up hose. Furs were valuable but rarely within reach for the poor. Instead, people kept piling wool upon wool until they waddled more than they walked. You glance down at your sleeves, stiff with frost and grime, and realize laundry isn't exactly an option either. Washing clothes in winter meant icy water, cracked hands, and frozen fabric. So what do? You wear the same cloak until it could practically stand up by itself. And here's the quirky detail to make you scratch at your scalp, because lice did. Lots of lice. Cloaks, hats, blankets, even the straw you slept on, infested. People didn't just huddle for warmth, they huddled with armies of crawling companions. Combs and ash baths helped, But truthfully, the tiny critters were part of the ecosystem of medieval life. Imagine leaning against your neighbor at the fire, chatting about bread rations, while your hairline stages a secret battle. Historians still argue whether medieval folks saw lice as simply annoying or downright dangerous, since lice could carry diseases like typhus. Either way, your cloak feels itchier now. You glance across the village square and see a nobleman on horseback, his cloak lined with fur, fox, squirrel, maybe even ermine if he's showing off. The difference is glaring. He radiates wealth with every swish of his hem, while you and your neighbors shuffle around looking like bundles of second-hand rugs. Social class wasn't just about land or coin, it was literally sewn into the fabric on your back. Even your hat, if you had one, betrayed your status. The itch continues as you pull the cloak tighter, and you can't help but laugh at the irony. You're fighting lice while hoping the wool keeps out frostbite. Fashion's little trade-off. In fact, some medieval remedies for lice read more like witchcraft than medicine. One suggestion: wear a poultice of crushed garlic under your cap. Sure, it might repel lice, or maybe just repel every other villager within a 5-foot radius. At night, the clothing issue doesn't end. You crawl into bed, really just a pile of straw stuffed into a sack, still wrapped in your cloak. Blankets are scarce, so your day clothes double as pajamas. The lice, yeah, they join you. It's a full-on sleepover party you never invited. You scratch your head, sigh, and remember that even kings weren't immune. Court records mention lice complaints in royal chambers. Imagine the poor chamberlain tasked with combing the king's scalp while keeping a straight face. But here's the part that gives you a sliver of respect for your scratchy cloak. Wool was brilliant at insulating even when wet. It trapped heat, breathed just enough to keep you from suffocating, and lasted for years. That's why, despite the itch and the critters, medieval folks swore by it. It was their armor against winter, every thread holding a promise of one more day endured. By the dim light of a tallow candle, you adjust the cloak around your shoulders. You imagine the lice rolling their tiny eyes as you scratch again. And you chuckle, because even in the bleakness of winter, there's humor here. You're bundled up like a walking haystack, itchy but alive, grateful for the scratchy miracle that keeps you from freezing. The cloak may be crawling, the wool may be rough, but it's better than nothing. In fact, in medieval winters, better than nothing often meant everything. The morning frost lingers on your eyelashes as you trudge up the hill, your scratchy cloak clinging to you like a damp dog. Ahead, the outline of the local lord's castle rises against the pale sky. You'd think this hulking stone fortress would offer warmth, but step inside and you quickly realize the truth. Castles in winter were less cozy retreats and more oversized refrigerators. The Great Hall greets you with a burst of smoke and chatter. A massive hearth roars at one end, its flames throwing shadows onto tapestries, banners, and bare stone walls. But the heat doesn't travel far. The hall is cavernous. The draft sneaks through arrow slits and high windows, and most of the space still feels icy enough to keep meat fresh for weeks. You shuffle closer to the hearth, competing with servants, squires, and hounds, all jostling for prime warmth spots. Here's a mainstream fact: medieval castles were notoriously hard to heat. Their thick stone walls, while excellent for defense, trapped cold as efficiently as they blocked arrows. Fires in the Great Hall were large, sometimes massive, but most of the heat shot straight up the chimney. Noble families and their guests clustered close to the blaze, while further back servants huddled in their cloaks, teeth chattering as if they were standing outside. You glance around at the nobles wrapped in furs, foxtails draped casually over shoulders, sipping warm, spiced wine. They look comfortable enough, but even they shivered at night. Beds were stacked with multiple layers of blankets, fur coverings, and even curtains around the frame to trap body heat. It's like sleeping in a fabric fortress within a stone fortress, a medieval version of double insulation. You imagine yourself burrowed inside, peeking through the curtains to see if frost formed on your nose. The quirky tidbit: Some nobles resorted to sleeping with warmed stones or even small dogs tucked under their covers, living hot water bottles with wagging tails. And while the lapdog for warmth trend sounds adorable, the smell of damp dog mixed with medieval hygiene standards is less enchanting. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread habit or a luxury quirk of certain courts. Either way, you're reconsidering letting that shaggy terrier into your bed. You wander deeper into the hall and notice another problem: smoke. Chimneys were a developing technology, not always present or effective. Fires often filled rooms with choking fumes. People's eyes stung, lungs burned, and black soot coated the walls. Some joked that you couldn't tell if you were shivering from cold or coughing from smoke. The Great Hall wasn't just a gathering place. It was a medieval version of a dive bar, warm, lively, and guaranteed to ruin your lungs. And then there are the drafts. You feel one snake across your ankles like icy fingers. Nobles tried to fix it with tapestries, hangings, and rushes strewn across the floor. Rushes, bundles of reeds mixed with herbs, were supposed to insulate and freshen the air. In reality, they turned into damp, straw-like messes crawling with bugs. You grin at the thought, "Welcome to my castle. Do mind the beetles." Still, life inside these walls offered advantages over your smoky hut in the village. Nobles at least had meat stews, mulled wine, and entertainments like minstrels and storytellers to distract from the chill. You pause near a group of servants juggling trays, their breath fogging in the cold, and realize that while the rich had warmth in numbers, the poor outside had little more than each other. You settle yourself on a bench, pulling your cloak tighter, listening to the hum of voices blending with the crackle of fire. It's almost cozy, if you ignore the drafts tugging at your boots and the smell of half-burnt meat wafting from the kitchen. You smile faintly, imagining the modern fantasy version of castles with roaring fireplaces in every room. The reality is closer to living in a stone cave with extra banners. Night falls, and the hall dims to candlelight. You slip into a corner, watching servants spread furs on a noble's bed, tugging the curtains tight to make a cocoon. Somewhere, a hound curls at the foot, ready to radiate heat all night. You sigh, teeth still chattering, and think castles were mighty fortresses, symbols of power and prestige. But in winter, they were just big, drafty refrigerators where even kings huddled like peasants. The castle walls fade behind you as you trudge down toward the valley, the icy wind slicing harder now that you're away from the smoky hearth. The ground crunches like brittle glass under your boots, and in the distance you can see the shimmer of the river, its surface sealed into a solid sheet of white. You wander closer, breath fogging, and realize just how much life freezes when the water does. Rivers are lifelines, arteries that carry fish, trade, travel, and gossip, but in winter they become stubborn slabs of ice. A mainstream fact here, during the harsher centuries of the medieval Little Ice Age, major rivers like the Thames in London or the Seine in Paris regularly froze over. For weeks, sometimes months, barges stopped moving, mills stopped grinding, and markets that depended on those waterways simply vanished. Commerce screeched to a halt under a crust of ice you could skate across if you dared. You step gingerly onto the edge of the frozen river, the ice moaning faintly under your weight. Villagers hack through with axes, lowering wicker fish traps into holes, but the catches are scarce. Most fish have moved deeper or are simply inaccessible until the thaw. Winter is not generous to fishermen. Without fresh fish, the already bread-heavy diet becomes even duller. You can almost hear medieval children sighing, "Not barley stew again." The quirky bit, frozen rivers sometimes became playgrounds and impromptu highways. People dragged sledges loaded with firewood across, skipping the long routes around. In some winters, markets and even festivals sprang up right on the ice. London's famous frost fairs, complete with games, stalls, and roasting meat, turned misery into carnival. Imagine buying hot ale while standing on the river's belly, praying it didn't decide to crack that day. Historians still argue whether smaller villages adopted the same festive mood, or whether fairs were mainly a city thing. Either way, you're tempted to carve Samra was here with your boot heel into the frosty surface. Still, the danger is real. The ice shifts and groans, threatening to swallow anyone reckless enough to trust it too far. You picture yourself trudging across, arms balancing a bundle of wood, when suddenly, crack. The cold water doesn't just sting, it suffocates. Survival rates for anyone who fell through were grim. Cloaks, boots, and tunics turned into anchors, dragging people under. Villagers sometimes tied ropes around their waists before venturing out, hoping their neighbours could haul them back if the ice betrayed them. Practical? Sure. Dignified? Not so much. As you move along the bank, you notice mills sitting idle, their wheels frozen stiff. That's another problem. Grain mills powered by rivers ground to a halt in winter. No milling meant no flour, which meant bread became even scarcer or more adulterated. People returned to hand querns, grinding by muscle instead of water. The droning scrape of stone on stone fills your ears just thinking about it. Your arms ache in sympathy for the peasants who spent hours daily turning a crank just to make enough flour for one loaf. You glance back toward the village and see merchants' carts parked uselessly by the frozen ford. Trade that would normally flow, salt, cloth, spices, even news, stops dead. Winter wasn't just a season, it was an embargo imposed by nature. You realize that your world has shrunk drastically. Where once you could expect strangers passing through, stories from distant towns, maybe a jug of wine from far-off vineyards, now it's just you, your neighbours, and the icy silence. But here's where things take a slightly lighter turn. Some folks learned to adapt. Ice itself became a tool. Blocks were hacked from rivers, stored in straw-packed pits, and used later to preserve meat or cool ale. Imagine offering your medieval friend a chilled drink in July and saying, "Yeah, I saved this ice from last winter." Suddenly, you're the coolest person in the village, literally. The sun slips lower, painting the frozen river gold. Children skate across it with bones strapped to their boots, an early form of ice skating that looks clumsy but joyous. They laugh, tumble and skid, their playfulness echoing off the frosted hills. You smile, because even here, even in this bleak stretch of hunger and cold, humans find ways to turn misery into moments of fun. And yet hunger always circles back. With fish scarce and mills frozen, bellies grumble louder. Families gather at the river not just to fetch water, but to gossip who has enough grain, who is rationing, who might starve. Rumours stick like frost. You overhear an old woman mutter that the ice this year is a sign of God's displeasure, punishment for sins. Her neighbour rolls his eyes and says it's just weather. Historians still argue whether medieval people leaned more on superstition or pragmatism when interpreting harsh winters. Probably both, because when you're freezing, you'll take any explanation that makes sense of your misery. Night Cree. Peas in fast. The river, glowing faintly under the moon, looks almost inviting, like a silver road leading to nowhere. You picture traders in summer, their boats loaded with goods, songs carrying downstream. Now there's silence, just the occasional groan of shifting ice as if the river is dreaming of spring. You pull your cloak tighter, toes numb in your boots, and step away from the bank. Tonight there will be no fish stew, no freshly ground flour, no lively markets. Just barley bread, smoky pottage, and the same battle to stay warm. The frozen river is a mirror reflecting your own stillness. Life halts, waits, endures. And as you trudge back toward the huts, you realize something chillingly funny. The The medieval village's weather report had only one update all season. Still frozen, still miserable. You laugh softly, breath clouding the air, because even in the silence you know you're part of a story much bigger than this village, bigger than this winter. Rivers freeze, markets vanish, and yet you keep walking. The frozen river fades behind you as your stomach twists again. You shuffle toward the village centre, hoping for the distraction of a meal. But when you step inside the hall where food is shared, your heart sinks. The long tables, once loaded during harvest with bread, roasted meats and jugs of ale, look barren now, bare planks dotted with only a few bowls of thin stew, some crusts, and a handful of turnips that look as though they've seen better centuries. Winter, you quickly realize, doesn't just starve your body, it strips away joy. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval feasts were legendary in the warmer months, especially around harvest festivals or major church holidays. Venison, boar, goose, pies, puddings, and gallons of ale spilled across the tables while musicians played. But winter, by mid-January, most of the salted meat stores were thinning, vegetables shriveled in storage, and what remained had to be rationed carefully. The abundance of Michaelmas or Christmas was a distant memory by February. The banquet tables shrank to survival rations, the joy replaced by grumbling stomachs and endless prayers for spring. You slump onto a bench, staring at the meal in front of you. A wooden bowl holds a watery stew, more broth than substance. You poke at it with a spoon, nudging a mysterious lump that might be meat or might be yesterday's bread boiled until it gave up. Quirky tidbit. Mystery meat stew wasn't just a joke. Scraps, offal, and anything vaguely edible went into the pot. Sometimes cats or dogs mysteriously vanished when the hunger grew worst, though few liked to admit it. Historians still argue whether such desperate eating habits were widespread in hard winters, or just stories repeated to emphasize the depth of famine. Either way, you suddenly eye the stew with less enthusiasm. The air in the hall is thick with smoke from tallow candles and the hearth. Families sit together, bowls in hand, sipping slowly, making the food last. A child slurps loudly at the broth, then licks the spoon as though it were a roasted chicken leg. You glance at your neighbour and catch a sad grin. They're all thinking the same thing. Even in the leanest times, people pretended their food was better than it was. Medieval imagination wasn't just for saints and stories, it was for soup too. And then there's the bread. Remember the dry barley loaves from earlier? They make another appearance, floating in the broth like tired little rafts. Stale bread was rarely wasted. Instead, it was dunked into hot liquid until soft enough to chew. Today, you'd call it croutons. Back then, it was just the art of recycling meals. You dunk a chunk, watching it sag and collapse, then chew it down. It fills the hole in your belly but does little for your spirit. The jokes almost write themselves. Imagine inviting friends over for dinner in winter. What's on the menu? Soup again, with bread again. Surprise! Even the nobles weren't immune to this repetition, though their soups were richer, with spices like pepper, saffron, or ginger. Imported luxuries peasants never even smelled. For you, the only spice is a pinch of salt, if you're lucky. More often it's just bland warmth in a bowl. You hear an old man mumbling about past winters when the tables sagged under roasted goose and puddings thick with eggs and honey. His nostalgia stings a little, because you know he's right. Winter wasn't just a season of hunger, it was a season of memories, when people compared today's scraps to yesterday's feasts, and memories can feel crueler than the cold. Still, survival meant finding comfort where you could. Families sang during meals, even thin ones to keep morale up. Someone starts a quiet tune at the end of the table now, a lilting song about summer fields and warm sun. The children clap along, bowls in hand, smiling through cracked lips, and for a moment you feel the hunger soften, not because your stomach is full, but because your spirit is fed. Then a murmur passes down the table. The last of the salted pork has been opened. A hunk sits on the board at the head of the hall, its edges shriveled from months in storage. It's precious, too precious to eat freely. The Lord's steward slices it thin, paper-thin, handing each family a sliver to float in their broth. You take your share, watch the fat melt into the liquid, and sip greedily. For a moment it tastes like a feast, like memory made real. But it vanishes too quickly, swallowed with a sigh. Historians still argue whether the lack of food in winter united communities or divided them. Some records suggest neighbours pooled what little they had, eating together as you are now. Others hint at theft, suspicion, and hoarding. You glance around the hall at the families sipping side by side, and for tonight it feels united. But you wonder what happens when the stew pot runs dry in a few weeks. The night deepens, the bowls are emptied, the fire dies lower, and the children doze against their parents' shoulders. You step outside into the brittle air again, stomach filled just enough to stop the pain, though not enough to silence it. The stars gleam overhead, cold and distant, and you realize winter doesn't just starve your body. It starves joy, turning feasts into memories and meals into compromises. And yet you keep walking, because tomorrow another pot will bubble weakly, another loaf will soften in broth, and another song will rise in the smoky hall. Not a feast, no, but enough. Barely enough. You push open the alehouse door, and a wave of warmth, noise, and breath steam rolls over you like a wool blanket that smells faintly of barley. Inside, the world is amber, firelight flickering on wooden beams, mugs thudding, voices braiding into a steady hum that almost drowns out the wind clawing at the shutters. You edge to the bench, wrap your hands around a wooden mug and take a hopeful sip, only to meet a slushy, half-frozen gulp that numbs your lips. Congratulations, you've discovered winter's special, Ale a la ice chunk. The patrons laugh as you make a face, but they know the drill. Cellars run cold, casks flirt with freezing, the surface crusts into a chilly cap you have to break with the rim of your mug. Still, you drink because this is winter's comfort. Liquid bread, safer than the well and warmer to the spirit than a sermon. A mainstream historical fact throughout much of medieval Europe, ale, often unhopped, was the everyday drink for all ages, with stronger brews for feasts and weaker small ale for routine hydration. By the later Middle Ages, hops began sneaking into the brew in some regions, changing flavour and shelf life. By the early modern period, hopped beer takes over in many places, but here, tonight, you're squarely in ale country. Grain, water, yeast, and the hope that the brewer said the right number of prayers. You blow on your mug and watch the top soften, crystals turning back to foam. The room smells of malt, smoke, damp wool, and a hint of onions, because of course it does. Benches are crammed, labourers with frost-red knuckles, a pair of shepherds still dusted with snow, and an old woman with a face like a wrinkled apple, laughing at a joke she's definitely heard before. Over near the hearth, a fiddler saws out a tune that sounds like laughter tripping over its own feet. For a second, you feel your shoulders drop, the cold, loosening grip. Quirky tidbit time. The alewife, the woman who brews and sells from her home, hangs out a broom or a bush to signal fresh ale on tap. That's your signpost. A leafy open notice before neon signs were cool. Some places even have the official ale tasters, whose job is to check quality and price, and, let's be honest, to enjoy a very specific perk. You spot a fellow with a polished badge and a self-satisfied grin. He swears he's here on business. Sure, friend, absolutely business. You take another sip. The slush gives way to a toasty malt warmth creeping down your throat. Someone passes a pitcher of hot spiced ale, mulled with a whisper of herbs and maybe a scrape of ginger if the house can afford it. A red-hot poker hisses as it dips into a cup, throwing up a puff of sweet steam. Is this a winter miracle or just tavern theatre? Either way, your fingers regain feeling while your eyebrows try not to singe. Historians still argue whether hot possets and mulled ales were common in humble alehouses or mainly a festive or wealthier treat. Yet on nights like this, it's easy to imagine even the poorest chasing heat in a spiced cup. Around you, the mood swells, ale loosening tongues, thinning patience. Supplies are running low this late in the season, and everyone knows it. The brewer has been stretching grain, coaxing flavour from tired malt, and praying the last cask holds out until the next brew finishes. That means cues, grumbles, and the occasional "who drank more than his share" accusation. You watch two men eyeball a single mug like it's treasure. A third slides in with a joke about adopting the cup and giving it a better life. Joke 1. Save the mug. It's already been through so much. The ale house is more than drink, though. It's winter's newsroom and therapy bench, the place to hear who slipped through river ice, which field wall collapsed, and whether the Lord's steward is secretly hoarding good barley. You pick up fragments. Someone's pig went missing, someone else claims to have seen a wolf at dusk, and a mason promises he can fix every chimney draught in the village for a fair price and a hot supper. The promises get bigger as mugs get emptier. At the corner table, a group plays tables, an ancestor of backgammon, moving pieces with the solemn intensity of bishops. Dice clatter somewhere behind you, illegal in some towns, but conveniently overlooked in weather like this. The parish priest ducks in, shakes snow from his shoulders, and surveys the room with a look that says he knows half the congregation will need extra forgiveness by morning. He warms his hands at the hearth, then pretends he's only here for pastoral reasons. Joke 2. Strictly pastoral with a foamy head. Another mug, and the warmth spreads right out to your fingertips. You think of the assize of bread and ale, those medieval regulations meant to keep prices fair and quality acceptable, and realize that rules are comforting in winter. They promise that someone, somewhere, is minding the scales. Of course, that doesn't stop a crafty alewife from diluting a cask when grain runs scarce, or from serving the slushiest mug to the last man in line. The line tonight shortens as people drift home, cheeks pink, voices mellowed, bellies not exactly full, but no longer angry. You consider how much alcohol is actually in your cup. Contrary to modern pub myths, the everyday ale wasn't designed to floor you. It was often weak, brewed for safety and calories more than merriment. That said, drink enough weak and your boots still forget how to stand in a straight line. Historians still argue whether ordinary folk were perpetually tipsy or simply hydrated on low-alcohol ale. Your wobble on the way to the hearth suggests the truth lives somewhere between science and storytelling. The door bangs open and a gust of knives-in-the-face wind slices through the laughter. In pour two carters, cloaks crusted with icy rime, shouting happily about the road being not completely impossible. Winter lowers everyone's standards. They clap snow from their hats, claim the nearest bench, and call for mugs that arrive with a visible slush halo. One dips a hunk of black bread in his ale, dunking life hack, and chews with fiery satisfaction. Joke 3. If bread is just crunchy ale, you've cracked the system. There's a quiet ritual here, a toast to absent friends, to good harvests, to surviving February with all 10 toes. Someone proposes to spring, and the room answers like a choir. You lift your cup, ice crystals chiming faintly on the rim, and drink to hope. The fiddler slides into a gentler tune. A woman near the hearth tells a story about a snow spirit who steals loaves but leaves warmth. A child, half asleep, asks if the spirit takes onions instead. The room laughs softly. And just as the evening could slip into rowdy, the alewife taps the cask and the sound is hollow, almost done. She announces there's enough for a few more mugs and the room rearranges itself into polite urgency. You trade your place in line to an old man with trembling hands and feel oddly rich. The ale that remains tastes watery, thin, but it's shared. That makes it better than it is. When you step outside, the cold slaps you awake. Your breath plumes, your ears ring with the memory of strings, chatter, and the sting of hot spice. The road sparkles with frost, and your footprints wobble just enough to tell the story of a night well spent. In a winter that takes and takes, the alehouse gives. Warmth, rumour, a little laughter, a little courage. Tomorrow the cask will be lighter, the grain bin smaller, the brewer more worried. But tonight you carry a small fire inside you, banked by malt and music. You tuck your chin into your collar and head for the dim outline of your door. The river still sleeps under ice, the fields still sulk in white, and the sky still bites. But your steps sound steadier than they did this afternoon. Maybe it's the ale, maybe it's the people. Maybe it's the feeling that in this bleak season, one shared mug can thaw a room, briefly, brightly, before the wind remembers your name. You leave the alehouse with the last warmth humming in your chest, and the night meets you like a cold-handed usher guiding you back toward your door. Your fingers tingle inside your mittens, half from frost, half from nerves, as you reach to touch the little token hanging at your neck. A sliver of pewter shaped like a tiny flask knocks against your collarbone. A pilgrim's ampulla, stamped with the sign of a saint who's supposed to look after travellers and the perpetually chilly. In winter, faith isn't abstract. It's something you can grip between numb fingers. The village lane is quiet except for a low mutter of wind through wattled fences. You pass doorways scratched with little wheels and overlapping circles, apotropaic daisy wheels that glow pale where soot has missed them. Your own lintel has one too, cut last year with a dull knife and lots of hope. Are you trying to keep out devils, wolves, or drafts? Yes. Triple coverage, highly recommended. A mainstream fact to warm the mind, at least. From the 12th to 16th centuries, cheap lead tin pilgrim badges and ampullae were mass-produced and worn on cloaks and hats across Europe, both as souvenirs of shrines and as portable protection. Your pewter flask likely once held a droplet of blessed water or oil. If it's vaporized by now, well, holiness has never minded being invisible. Your neighbor greets you with a hunched nod and shows off his own winter insurance, a tiny pouch at his belt. Inside, he whispers, are grains of blessed salt from Candlemas, when the priest blessed candles for the year, and sometimes salt and water too. You remember that morning clearly, the whole village crammed into the nave, breath turning to mist, waxy light sliding over stone. Candlemas sits in early February like a small lighthouse in the long dark, and people clutch the stub of that blessed taper as if it were a portable sunrise. Tonight you slide a finger along the wick of yours, tucked into your sleeve, the faint scent of beeswax lingering like a kindly ghost. And then there are the charms that sit halfway between prayer and practical joke. The old woman 3 cottages down swears that a hagstone, a pebble with a naturally worn hole, hung by the door keeps winter fevers out and cows in milk. She also claims it improves bread rising if you whisper to it nicely. And who are you to argue when your loaves currently double as masonry? Historians still argue whether such objects were viewed as innocent folk piety or condemned as superstitious meddling. Yet parish records often show priests tolerating them in winter when morale needed help as much as bodies did. Survival has a way of rounding off theological corners. You push into your hut and set the pewter ampulla on a peg by the hearth, where it will watch the embers. You've tucked other protections there too, a sprig of rosemary from last summer, now brittle as ash, a small iron nail, because iron is supposed to offend anything sneaky, and a patch of parchment with 3 words stacked in a triangle, letters stepping down like a staircase. You found it in the bottom of a chest, someone's old abracadabra, a nonsense charm from a medical book promising to shrink fevers as the word shrinks line by line. Does it work? Maybe. Does it make you feel less alone while the wind tests every crack in your wall? Definitely. Joke 1. You decide to keep the parchment because even your fevers deserve quality typography. A knock rattles your door. It's the shepherd from the far pasture, a scarf wrapped twice around his head, eyes watering from the cold. He asks if you'll walk with him at dawn to the crossroad where the little wayside shrine stands. A few villagers plan to leave offerings, worn ribbons, a bit of wool, a half-stale loaf, to St. Bridget, whose day just passed, because she minds cattle and hearths, and honestly, any saint with hearth in their portfolio is getting extra business this month. You nod. The shrine is only a rough post with a weathered icon, but in winter it feels like a border station between this bitter world and somewhere warmer. Night stretches and your hut fills with small glows, a coal coaxed to life, a candle nub propped in a dish, the faint sheen on your pewter badge. You wrap your cloak, yes, the itchy one, and try to massage warmth into your toes while humming a sleepy hymn that still smells of the church's cold stone. Another charm sits on your shelf. A wool cord knotted 9 times, each knot tied with a muttered prayer against chilblains. The cord scratches like everything else, but you wear it anyway. Quirky tidbit. Some folks swore a dried mole's foot carried in a pocket kept frostbite away. You have not tested this. You hope you never will. Joke 2. You briefly imagine pitching it at the alehouse. Limited edition mole foot warmers, ethically sourced somehow. Before sleep, you reheat a little ale with a finger of honey and a generous claim that it's medicinal. You catch yourself counting protections like a merchant counts coins: candle stub, pilgrim badge, rosemary, iron, knot cord, chalk mark above the door. It feels slightly ridiculous and entirely necessary. Winter turns everyone into a collector of hope. At daybreak, pale and grudging, you and a few neighbours crunch out onto the road. The shrine leans into the ditch like a weary sentinel. And someone's tied a plait of straw to its post. Someone else has wedged a pewter badge of St. Christopher in the crack. The saint of travellers, now also the saint of people travelling precisely nowhere. You add your offering, a wisp of wool from your cloak, surrendered with a small laugh. Take the itch with it, you murmur. The shepherd lays a tuft from his best ewe and asks for mercy on lambing time. A girl presses a little loaf, the top scored with a cross, and prays it won't be the last decent bread until spring. A mainstream fact to plant your feet. The parish calendar doesn't stop for weather. Processions on rogation days, blessings at Candlemas and St. Blaise's feast, throats crossed by 2 candles, and the steady drum of Mass anchor the year. These rites knit villages together when everything else is fraying. Whether you came for doctrine, habit, or simply the chance to stand shoulder to shoulder in something warmer than your hut, you came. And there was that other layer, the one no rule book owns. The whispered charm spoken over a child's red hands, the sign traced on a door when the wind howled like a living thing. On the way back, the old woman with the hagstone tells you to hang your Candlemas stub near the hen roost. It will keep foxes shy. You blink. That's new. She shrugs. If it works, you'll know because you still have hens. It's the kind of logic winter loves. Practical, testable, carried on a string. By noon, clouds flatten the sky into dull pewter and your breath plumes like a lazy saint's incense. You think of the great shrines, Canterbury for Becket, Walsingham for Our Lady, Santiago far away, and of the market stalls that sell rows of badges for a handful of coins. It's industry and devotion braided tight, metal hopes stamped by the hundreds. Historians still argue whether pilgrims wore badges chiefly to brag about miles walked or to borrow a saint's spillover power for the next mile of life. You suspect both because the human heart is a hoarder, especially in February. Back at your hearth, you replay the morning's small ceremony and feel a calm settle, the kind that sits heavy and helpful at the base of your ribs. You're not naive. You know a lead trinket can't heat a room, but there's warmth in layers: body, fire, neighbor, prayer. And tonight you've stacked them as carefully as rushes on the floor. You pin your badge higher on your cloak so it doesn't thump your collarbone, and the pewter flashes in the dim light like a wink. Joke 3. You tell yourself it's the medieval equivalent of a heated jacket. Battery not included. Miracles sold separately. As evening folds in, a fox yips beyond the hedgerow and the wind rehearses its familiar complaint. You bank the fire, slide the iron nail a finger's breadth closer to the door, and set the candle stub within easy reach. Faith and superstition, call them two mittens of the same pair. Cradle your hands around the long night. If tomorrow dawns colder, you'll tie a 10th knot, scratch another wheel, whisper another name. It's not about certainty, it's about steadying your breath until the thaw remembers you. The night has gone still, unnervingly so, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until even your heartbeat sounds too loud. You lie awake on your straw pallet, cloak pulled up to your chin, when the sound comes, low, mournful, and far too close. A wolf's howl, stretched across the frozen fields like a warning bell. You freeze, every muscle stiffening because wolves are not fairy tales here. They are winter's second army, marching in when hunger drives them from the forests. You shuffle outside with a lantern, though the weak flame feels pitiful against the ink-black sky. Frost coats everything, the hedges, the well, even the chicken coop that now resembles a block of carved ice. You aren't the only one who heard it. Doors creak open, neighbors emerge, all clutching spears, staffs, or anything sharp enough to matter. The village forms a kind of ragged circle, eyes scanning the dark, and then another howl answers, closer this time. The sound vibrates in your ribs like a drum you didn't agree to play. Here's a mainstream fact to anchor the fear. Wolves were common across Europe through the Middle Ages, especially during the colder centuries when forests stretched wider and livestock grazed at their edges. In hard winters, wolf packs pushed boldly into villages, raiding pens and sometimes attacking people. Medieval chronicles even record whole winters where wolves roamed city streets, scavenging corpses during famines or plagues. Wolves were not folklore, they were neighbours with sharp teeth. A shadow shifts at the tree line and you swear you see eyes glinting back at you. A farmer mutters that wolves can smell fear. You mutter back that they can probably also smell the goat penned 2 huts down. The joke falls flat because everyone's too busy imagining the same thing. What happens if the goats go tonight? Meat, milk and wool vanish in one bite. Your neighbour grips his staff harder. Quirky tidbit. Some villagers believed that tying bits of iron to a door kept wolves away, just as it did spirits. Others smeared ash in a ring around the livestock pen, hoping the smell would repel them. A few even swore by hanging wolf skulls at the edge of the field to warn the living pack, "See what happened to your cousin." Historians still argue whether these practices were ritual magic, folk psychology, or just desperate attempts to do something when the howls got too close. The sound comes again, and this time it's joined by rustling. The village dogs bark, tails down, hackles up, and you feel the old rhythm of panic tighten the air. A man at the far side of the circle shouts and throws a torch. It lands with a hiss in the snow, sputtering but glowing enough to send a pair of shapes darting back into the shadows. Relief ripples through the group. Wolves fear fire. Everyone exhales, though no one relaxes. You can't help but think of medieval sermons that compared wolves to devils, always hunting the flock. Priests spoke of sheepfolds and shepherds, but villagers heard a more literal echo. Wolves do come for the flock. Tonight, theology feels like field notes. The howl is a sermon in its own right, telling you where you stand in the food chain. And then you remember the wolf hunts, those grim community affairs, men banding together with spears, bows and dogs, marching into the forest to flush the beasts out. Sometimes it worked, sometimes the wolves doubled back and circled the hunters. You imagine yourself stumbling through drifts, torch flickering, the forest alive with moving shadows. You shiver harder than the wind demands. A child tugs at your cloak, wide-eyed, asking if the wolves will come inside the house. You kneel and murmur something soothing. No, of course not. The fire keeps them back. The saints keep watch. But in truth, you're not sure. Wolves testing doors, wolves tearing through thatch, wolves dragging away pigs or sheep. It has all happened. That's why you and your neighbours keep torches burning through the night. Why spears lean against every door. Historians still argue about the scale of wolf danger. Some claim the chroniclers exaggerated, using wolves as symbols of chaos. Others say the sheer number of laws, bounties and communal hunts prove the threat was real. Tonight, you don't need a historian. You just need the howls to stop. Hours pass. The pack lingers at the edge of hearing, circling, waiting. At last, the first smear of dawn shows on the horizon. The howls fade, replaced by the caw of a crow overhead. The village exhales as one, shoulders slumping, weapons lowering. You drag yourself back inside, throat raw from cold air and nerves. Before you curl under your cloak again, you make a joke to yourself, half to lighten the fear. Well, at least the wolves didn't want my onion pocket. The laugh rattles weakly out of you, but it works. Humour, like fire, is a torch you throw into the dark, and sometimes it keeps the wolves far enough away for you to sleep. The howls fade with the dawn, but you don't get to rest. Your chest feels heavy, your throat raw, and every breath scratches like straw. You cough, the sound rattling in your ribs. And suddenly you remember one of winter's other brutal guests, illness. If wolves prowl outside the village, sickness lurks inside, crouched in smoky corners, waiting for lungs already tired from the cold. You shuffle across the floor, the straw crackling beneath your boots, and push open the door. Smoke greets you first, thick grey, clinging to the roof beams. You cough again, eyes watering. A mainstream fact. Medieval huts often had no chimneys, just a smoke hole in the roof. Fires smouldered in the centre of the room, and the smoke lingered, coating walls black and filling lungs with soot. Respiratory problems were common, especially in winter when fires burned day and night. You're not just fighting cold, you're inhaling it. Your neighbour's child coughs too, a high-pitched, desperate bark that makes you wince. The family crowds around the hearth, huddling for warmth but breathing in the very thing that worsens their fevers. You catch sight of the mother waving a sprig of herbs through the smoke, muttering a charm. Quirky tidbit. Some households believed burning juniper or rosemary could clean the air, both spiritually and physically. Did it help? Maybe a little. The smoke was fragrant at least, and herbs have antiseptic qualities. Historians still argue whether these rituals were symbolic, medicinal, or both. You just know it smells nicer than peat alone. You remember plagues that once stalked villages like wolves in human form. The Great Famine, the Black Death, words that made people shiver even when the fevers had passed. And though tonight isn't that scale of horror, winter sickness feels like a siege. Crowded huts, poor diets, and endless damp create the perfect breeding ground for the colds, fevers, and worse. You sit with your mug of lukewarm ale staring at the liquid. It was safer than water, yes, but it didn't cure much. Remedies abounded. Honey in warm milk, garlic poultices, onion broth. Some even recommended dried frog powdered into a draught for coughs. You wrinkle your nose and make a silent vow. You'll stick with honey. Joke 1. If I'm drinking frog powder, the cough might as well finish me. The priest arrives mid-morning, called to bless the sick. He carries a little reliquary, something holy small enough to fit in his hand, and a flask of oil for anointing. The family kneels, children peeking nervously, while he murmurs prayers that swirl with the smoke. Faith is medicine too. It steadies hearts when nothing else works. You bow your head, not so much convinced as comforted. In times when real cures are scarce, ritual is the strongest drug. A boy in the back of the hut sneezes so hard he falls off the bench. Everyone laughs, the sound bubbling up like a relief valve. Humour is survival too. You think of all the odd cures you've heard, tying a donkey's hair around your neck for sore throats, wearing a dried toad in a pouch against fever, or drinking wine boiled with sage and pepper. Joke too, nothing says healing like spicy wine and donkey dandruff. Each story holds a mix of desperation and hope, proof that people never stopped trying. But sickness also changes the rhythm of the village. Work slows, fields go untended, even the communal oven is quieter. You walk to the square and hear fewer voices than usual, the silence cut by coughing that echoes from hut to hut. It feels like winter itself is exhaling through every chest, one long wheeze across the valley. Historians still argue whether winters increased plague risks or lessened them. Some claim the cold slowed spread, while others point to crowded huts and poor diets making people more vulnerable. The truth is probably both. Illness moved differently in winter, not always faster, but always more feared. You feel that fear now, gnawing at you as sharply as hunger. By late afternoon, the coughing in your chest eases a little. You step outside, desperate for fresh air, even if it's knife cold. The sky is the pale blue of frozen glass, the fields glittering like they're set with shards of broken mirrors. You inhale, lungs burning but grateful, and you realize why so many prayers, charms, and remedies exist. Because sickness in winter isn't just an inconvenience, it's another predator. Back inside, you bank the fire, cough into your sleeve, and wrap yourself tighter in your cloak. You hum a tune you heard at the alehouse, a faint distraction, while the children laugh at the boy who sneezed himself off the bench. In moments like this, laughter is as precious as any herb, any prayer, any saint. The wolves may prowl outside, but inside, the smoky huts of winter breed their own shadows. Still, you endure, because coughing through the night means you're alive, and tomorrow might just bring a breath of easier air. You drag your feet through rutted snow, the kind that looks pretty from a window you don't have and feels like shredded glass under leather soles. The road ahead is a line of dented helmets and hunched shoulders, steam puffing from men and horses as if the whole column is a wheezing dragon. War doesn't wait for spring just because your toes disagree. It just changes costume, trading banners snapping in a warm breeze for standards frozen into stiff, sullen flags that clack like sheets of tin. You hike your cloak tighter, hear the creak of frozen straps, and taste iron in the air from a dozen unoiled male shirts complaining together. A mainstream fact to set your pace. While many medieval campaigns paused in midwinter, armies absolutely marched and fought in the cold when politics, hunger, or opportunity demanded it. Think of 1242, when the Teutonic Order met Novgorod on Lake Peipus, the battle on the ice. A winter clash that turned a frozen lake into a battlefield and a legend. You can almost feel the uncanny slickness beneath your boots as you picture ranks edging forward, breath fogging, faith and balance equally tested. The officer ahead raises a hand, the column slows. You hear horses snort, stamping to keep blood moving into their knobby, overworked legs. Cavalry suffers worst in this season. Fodder is scarce, hooves crack on ice, and a panicked fall can break a knight faster than any spear. The quartermaster mutters about hay the way poets talk about love. Without it, the most glorious charger is just a shivering lawn ornament. You remember the markets of scarcity and imagine someone trying to haggle for a bale the way others barter for bread. Joke 1. One bale of hay, slightly pre-chewed by a saint. Any takers? Armour turns treacherous now. Your mail shirt has a thin rime, links stiff where last night's melt crept in, and the leather under it smells tired. Smoke, sweat, and a hint of damp dog from that noble's living hot water bottle you met in the castle. The squire beside you rubs a breastplate with animal fat to slow the rust, swearing he'll never fall asleep near the fire again after scorching his vambrace last night. Quirky tidbit. Some soldiers stuffed straw beneath their chaussees and inside shoes for insulation, a miracle of medieval sock technology. It helps, until the straw turns into tiny mobile splinters that make you hop like you found a hedgehog in your boot. The road dives into a hollow full of sludge. Snow tamped to slush, slush churned to mud, mud frozen into ridges sharp enough to trip the saints. You step wrong and the cold rushes up your leg with intimate malice. Somewhere behind you, a cartwheel shrieks and snaps. The axle answers with a groan that feels like the world's oldest tree finally giving up. The carter throws up his hands and declares he's offering the broken spoke as a relic of St. I told you so. You nearly laugh, then you actually do, because in this marching misery, humour keeps your spine from melting. The commander rides past, cloak glittering with frost that looks fancy until you notice his lips are purple. He speaks of a village up ahead that took sides with the wrong lord at the wrong time. That's another winter truth. With fields idle and bellies thin, raids bloom like ice flowers. Stores of salt fish, smoked pork, grain, those are softer targets than walls. Historians still argue whether wintering armies mostly stayed put or constantly nipped at neighbours. Your feet, presently doing both staying and nipping, vote for yes. You crest a rise and see the field, a pale scab of ground with a shattered hedge snaking across it. The other force is there, shapes in the glare, a bristle of spears, horses hunched like guilty mountains. A horn wobbles somewhere, brave and slightly off-key, and the lines assemble with the clumsy grace of men whose joints resent orders. You find your place, shoulder to shoulder, shield rim pressing your numb knuckles. You breathe in, out, the rhythm that tries to drown the thought that your cloak, your lucky onion, your little pewter badge mean nothing to a lance. Yet you touch the badge anyway, because faith and superstition warm faster than fingers. A gust tears across the field, lifting fine snow that stings like a thrown fist. The first arrows arc slow, elegant frostbirds, then hiss into shields and frozen turf. Sound changes in cold. Everything is sharper, closer. You hear a man 3 ranks over whisper the Our Father as if he's inside your hood. You whisper with him, not out of piety alone, but because the words steady your breath until your heartbeat stops kicking the inside of your ribs. Then movement, cavalry trying a canter that looks more like a series of worried leaps. Hooves punch through crust, and a knight slants sideways, armour flashing like a toppled kettle. He's up again, but slower, the weight that made him terrifying in. Some are now arguing with gravity. The footline advances, boots crunching in a grim communal chew. Spears tilt, shouts tangle. You plant your feet and feel nothing. Your toes are rumours. Clash is messier in winter. Blades clink, scrape, stick where ice films the world. Men slip at the wrong second and discover that the ground can be an accomplice. Your shield catches a blow and vibrates your arm clear to the shoulder. You answer with a shove, a jab, and the kind of grunt that belongs in a pigsty, not a poem. Someone falls. Someone curses creatively about wolves filing a complaint for noise. For half a minute the world shrinks to breath and wood grain and the way sunlight finds a nick on your blade as if it were a mirror. And then space, a stagger back, a howl of orders, a ragged sort of reset. You suck in air that tastes like iron filings and pine smoke. A comrade presses a wineskin to your mouth. The liquid is half ice, half courage. You discover a dent on your helm the size of a walnut and decide it's fashionable. Joke 2. Night core. Dents are in this season. The fight resumes in jerks, as if winter itself were yanking the battlefield by a string. Eventually, one side decides the saints are elsewhere today. The line ripples, then withdraws, then spills away in a scramble that's almost graceful compared to the marching. You don't chase far. The commander has no interest in losing men to a patch of murderous black ice in the hedgerow. He calls the retreat, a tidy word for what feels like collapsing in place while pretending to walk. After, the field hums with the ugly chores of victory, tending to wounds, righting saddles, dragging a cart out of a ditch that's more philosophy than geography. You help unbuckle a man's cuirass, his fingers too stiff to work the straps, and rub warmth into his wrists, the way someone once did for you after a night at the frozen river. The surgeon arrives with thread, wine, and the expression of a man who has not slept since Michaelmas. He uses clean snow to wash a cut. It looks holy for a second before the red unfurls. He mutters to his apprentice about frostbite masquerading as courage. You look at your toes and decide they are definitely cowards. Quirky tidbit as night folds down. Men sleep in their mail if they fear a counter-raid, but they loosen the straps or slip a stick between chest and rings to keep metal from gluing to sweat. Someone swears by rubbing goose fat on soles before bed to keep them warm. Someone else swears by strong language. Historians still argue whether that famous battle on the ice truly took place on treacherous, cracking sheets or mostly on firm shore with a legend's flourish. Maybe truth wears layers, like you, ice at the edge, mud in the middle, story stretched across both. By the watchfire, you cradle a bowl of something hot and indefinable. The steam fogs your eyes. The warmth trickles in like a late apology. You trade jabs about who slipped most gracefully. Joke 3. You win best swan impression unintentional. Then fall quiet as the wind lifts in the hedges and the stars blink like flint sparks. Armor ticks while it cools, little pings like beetles knocking polite. You remember the wolves, the ale slush, the onion charm, the way a pewter badge glinted in candlelight, and you stack those memories like shields around your mind. War in winter is not glory. It is logistics with a sword, courage with chilblains, strategy paced by the sound of hooves losing their argument with ice. You curl nearer the embers, let the smoke lay a blanket on your lashes, and tell your aching feet what you tell your heart. Hold just a little longer. Spring is a rumor, but so, once, was victory. The battlefield fades into memory as night deepens and the next morning drags you back into the rhythm of winter life. You return to the village, throat still raw from smoke and cold air, and when the sun dips again, you find yourself seated in a dim room surrounded by the softer glow of candlelight. This is how most evenings pass, inside cramped huts with nothing but a stub of tallow candle or a smoking rushlight to stretch the darkness back a few inches. The flame sputters, sending up a smell halfway between cooked fat and burnt hair. That's exactly what it is, animal tallow moulded around a rag. A mainstream fact. Candles were luxuries in many medieval homes, more common in churches and noble households. Ordinary families used rushlights, dried rushes dipped in fat that burned quickly, unevenly, and dripped ash everywhere. You watch yours tilt sideways, then sputter out, and sigh as someone scrambles to light another. The dark presses close instantly, heavy and absolute. A reminder that night in winter is longer than patience itself. But people adapt. Families gather close, telling stories, riddles and songs. Tonight, an old man clears his throat and begins with a tale of a knight who outsmarted a troll by tricking it into gnawing its own foot. The children lean forward, eyes wide, while you smirk, partly at the story, partly at the old man's dramatic voice. Joke 1. You wonder if the troll was just hungry enough to think, well, a foot is still protein. Songs follow, voices weaving together. Some are hymns everyone knows, their Latin phrases half understood but soothing. Others are bawdy rhymes about taverns and foxes stealing hens. You add your voice, low and uneven, and it blends into the sleepy chorus. Quirky tidbit: some medieval riddles were crude enough to make even today's late-night comedians blush. Others were clever wordplay about nature or tools. I am hard all over, I make noise when struck, I help men in bed. What am I? Answer: a bell. The children giggle anyway because innuendo never ages. The room smells of wool, smoke, and stale bread. You rub your hands together not to warm them, though that helps, but because the rhythm keeps you awake. Falling asleep too early just means waking in the coldest stretch of night, and no one wants that. So you join the chatter. Someone recalls the frost fair from years ago, when the river froze hard enough for jugglers and puppet shows. Someone else counters with a darker memory of a neighbour who slipped through thin ice. Historians still argue whether people in remote villages truly spent winter nights in entertainment or mostly endured in silence. But the fragments of laughter and stories tonight feel convincing. The candle gutters lower and shadows climb the walls like living things. You stare at them, shapes flickering across rough plaster, and think how easily shadows can become stories. A squeak in the thatch turns into a mouse, or into a spirit if you're already anxious. Someone knocks the table, spilling ale, and the children squeal at the mess. The noise feels almost festive, like the village is throwing itself a miniature carnival against the endless dark. And then there's the silence that follows, heavier than any howl or cough. You feel it pressing, wrapping around you like a second cloak. That's when the stories take on a different edge. Someone mutters about spirits roaming longer in winter nights, how the boundary between living and dead thins when the world itself seems frozen. You shiver, not from cold this time, but from the thought of long-gone villagers wandering outside, rattling shutters. Joke 2. You remind yourself they'd freeze solid before they got to your door, so worst-case scenario, you just trip over a ghost-shaped ice block. A woman at the back plucks a lute string, filling the silence with sound. The notes are clumsy, but the melody smooths the fear. Children curl against parents, heavy with sleep, while the adults keep talking, their voices softer now. In the dim glow, faces blur into gentle outlines. It's less about what's said and more about not being alone in the dark. Quirky detail: some households lit candle watches, leaving a small flame burning through the night to keep spirits and thieves away. The downside? A fire risk. More than one chronicle records entire cottages going up because someone trusted a rushlight too close to straw. Still, the comfort of a flickering flame outweighed the danger. Historians still argue whether most families risked it, but judging by the smoky ceiling above you, this hut has flirted with disaster a few times. The last candle sags into a puddle of fat, light dimming until the shadows finally win. You huddle closer to the group, the warmth of bodies doing what fire cannot. Outside, snow creaks and branches snap. Inside, someone hums the tale of a song, a soft lullaby that pulls your eyes closed. You drift in that half space between waking and sleeping, still hearing voices, still feeling the heat of neighbours pressed close. You smile faintly before sleep, thinking that medieval evenings were never silent, never lonely, even when the food was thin and the cold endless. Stories, songs and laughter stitched the long dark together. Joke 3. You wonder if the troll from the old man's story is out there in the snow, hobbling on one foot looking for a better supper. And with that image, you surrender to the dark, not because it wins, but because you've outlasted it again. Morning light seeps reluctantly through cracks in the shutters, but the sound inside the hut is brighter than the sky. Laughter. High, sharp, resilient laughter that only children seem able to produce when the world outside looks like it belongs to frost giants. You sit up from your scratchy cloak pile and watch the little ones tumble about, wrapped in so many layers they resemble walking hay bales. Their boots, if they even qualify as boots, are just leather scraps stuffed with straw, tied tight around the ankles. They waddle and fall, squealing like piglets, then pop back up to chase each other again. A mainstream fact: medieval children worked hard in summer, helping with fields, animals, and endless chores. But in winter, with farming stalled and daylight short, their duties shrank. Play took a larger share of their time, and play often doubled as warmth, running, tumbling, or inventing games that kept blood moving. You smile as you see them tossing lumps of snow back and forth, inventing an early snowball fight. One girl laughs so hard she topples into a drift, only her wool hat sticking up like a tiny, triumphant flag. You notice how differently children approach the cold. While adults curse every gust of wind, the little ones seem to weave it into their fun. One boy skids across the frozen path on flat bones strapped to his feet, primitive ice skates smoothed with grease. He wobbles like a drunken goose, crashes gloriously, and then gets up with a grin that says the bruises don't matter. Quirky tidbit: bone skates were a common toy and tool in some parts of Europe, especially Scandinavia and the Low Countries. They turned winter travel into both necessity and entertainment. You chuckle thinking how your own toes can barely handle standing still on frozen ground, let alone sliding across it for fun. Still, not all is play. The laughter mingles with coughing, the same rattle you heard last night. Children were hardy in some ways, yet fragile in others. Malnutrition, cold, and illness hit them hardest. You notice one mother rubbing her child's hands briskly, muttering about chilblains and warming them by the hearth. Historians still argue whether medieval families viewed childhood as a distinct, protected stage or simply as small adults folded into daily survival. Watching the mixture of laughter, chores, and care, you sense it was both. Childhood was a brief window of play, framed by the duties waiting just outside it. The children's games continue. Two of them stage a wolf hunt, one kid howling dramatically while the others brandish sticks and chase him around the square. The adults laugh, shaking their heads, though everyone remembers the real howls too vividly. You smile at the way children turn fear into play, rehearsing survival with sticks and imagination. Joke 1. You half expect the wolf to demand his onion pocket back before surrendering. Inside the hut again, toys are simple but cherished. A little girl cradles a rag doll stuffed with scraps of wool, her thumb tracing its stitched face. Another boy proudly shows you his carved wooden horse, a gift from his grandfather. You turn it over in your hands, rough but sturdy, and marvel that in a season of scarcity, someone still carved joy out of wood. The day stretches slowly. Children are tasked with fetching bits of firewood, shaking straw for bedding, or carrying water from the well. They do it half-heartedly, breaking into games along the way. You see two boys assigned to fetch water return with their buckets mostly empty because they'd stopped to play knights with their staves. Their mother scolds them, then bursts out laughing herself. Sometimes discipline gives way to gratitude. They're still alive, still laughing, and in winter, that's enough. At night, when the candles burn low, the little ones pile together under blankets like puppies. You hear giggles and whispers, then sudden silence as sleep claims them. Quirky detail. Some households kept cradles close to the hearth, rocking babies with one foot while spinning wool or stirring the pot. The warmth of the fire and the mother's rhythm kept the child calm, and probably the mother too. Joke 2. You imagine advertising it as a medieval, hands-free parenting hack. You lie awake, listening to their soft breathing. In a season defined by scarcity, children bring abundance of sound, of energy, of reminders that life insists on continuing. Even their hunger-driven mischief, sneaking extra crusts, dipping fingers into the pottage, feels like proof that hope is alive. Historians still argue how much childhood joy truly existed in the Middle Ages, with some claiming life was too brutal for innocence and others pointing to lullabies, toys, and records of play as evidence of care. Watching the children laugh in the snow, you lean toward the second camp. Joy existed not because conditions were easy, but because children dragged it into existence with every giggle, every chase, every tumble into a snowdrift. And as you finally close your eyes, you smile faintly. The world outside is ice, wolves, and hunger. But inside this hut, wrapped in scratchy wool and straw, laughter echoes like a charm. Joke 3, you decide medieval kids invented the first snow day excuses. Sorry, chores postponed, drift ate my shoes. The children's laughter lingers in your ears even as the day drags on, but survival won't wait for play. Work hums steadily in the huts, hands busy at tasks that keep families alive when fields lie frozen and livestock huddle under makeshift shelters. You step inside one such hut and find the air thick with the smell of wool, smoke, and damp wood. A man leans over his bench, carving small handles from bone. A woman sits beside him, spindle whirling in her hand as she teases wool into yarn. Winter might halt the plough, but it doesn't silence work. A mainstream fact, seasonal trades thrived in winter, filling the gap between harvests. Spinning, weaving, tanning, carving, brewing, all these kept people occupied and provided goods to barter when food was scarce. Some of Europe's busiest textile centres relied on long months of indoor spinning, with entire families working together. You watch the spindle whirl, hear the soft creak of the loom, and realise that even in darkness and cold, industry doesn't stop. It simply changes shape. The man across from you chuckles as he sharpens his knife on a whetstone, explaining that bone and antler are his winter harvest. When hunting ended in autumn, scraps were stored for months of carving. Now he turns antlers into buttons and combs, bone into dice and handles, all of which can be traded later at spring markets. Quirky tidbit, dice weren't just toys, they doubled as divination tools. People sometimes rolled them to consult fortune as easily as they used them for tavern games. Historians still argue whether villagers saw dice as harmless play or risky flirts with sin. You suspect both, depending on whether someone won or lost. The woman with the spindle tells you her yarn will be dyed come spring when plants return. For now, she winds pale skeins, humming a tune to keep rhythm. Children nap near her feet, the clatter of the dee. Istaf their lullaby. You smile, realizing how much of medieval soundscape was made by tools, spindles, hammers, knives, not machines, just human hands repeating motions until muscle became memory. Joke 1, you imagine a medieval lo-fi beats to spin yarn to channel, just endless spindle clicks and crackling fire. In another hut, brewers tend casks, coaxing ale to ferment even in the cold. The smell is pungent, yeasty, sweet, slightly sour. Brewing was often women's work, a task passed down through households, and the alewife was as important as the blacksmith. She adjusts the cover on her vat and mutters that the last batch froze at the edges, souring too fast. You nod sympathetically, though you're really just trying not to sneeze from the haze. The tannery is less pleasant, hides soak in tubs, and the stench is strong enough to make your eyes water. Still, tanners work steadily, scraping and curing leather to sell later. Gloves, boots, belts, all essential in winter. You gag, then laugh weakly, realizing that the stink of tanning was infamous enough to give entire streets their reputation. Joke 2. If you're downwind of a tannery, congratulations, you'll never lose your way home. Even the hearth becomes a workshop. Women gather around the fire, twisting rushes into rushlights, patching clothes with scraps, or shelling dried beans for meals. Conversation flows with the work, complaints about aching fingers, gossip about who's hoarding grain, and hopeful speculation about how soon the snow might melt. You catch yourself smiling. In these moments, survival feels communal, stitched together by talk as much as by thread. Outside, the blacksmith hammers steadily in his forge, though bellows strain harder in the cold. Sparks leap like fireflies, briefly bright against grey air. He's mending tools, hoes, knives, hinges, anything that must endure until spring. Children peek in to watch, wide-eyed, as iron glows orange and bends under his hammer. For them, it's magic. For him, it's labour, steady as the heartbeat of the village. Historians still argue whether winter trades offered peasants genuine profit or merely survival-level barter. Records show both, craftsmen selling goods at distant fairs, but also families scraping just enough to pay rents. Watching now, you sense the truth lies in between. Winter work gave purpose, structure, and sometimes just enough coins to carry people through famine. As night creeps in, families gather again, setting aside tools but admiring what's been made. Buttons, yarn, patched cloaks. None are luxuries, but they represent resilience. Children play with carved toys fresh from the knife, while adults admire finished skeins. You notice pride in the craftsman's eyes, the quiet dignity of turning hardship into craft. You lean back, soothed by the sounds of whirring spindles and crackling fires, and realize winter trades weren't just about objects. They were about holding despair at bay. When the land offered nothing, hands made something, and that something, however small, kept the village tethered to survival. Joke 3. Wow. You mutter that if Etsy had existed in the 14th century, half this village would be 5-star sellers of artisan rustic chic bone dice. The fire burns low, the spindles slow, and work fades into rest, but the memory of it lingers. Winter may silence the fields, but not the people. And in every carved comb, every skein of wool, every battered pair of patched boots, you hear the same message whispered: endure. The next morning you wake with stiff joints and the faint taste of smoke still clinging to your tongue. Outside, the snow lies heavy, sculpted into drifts like frozen waves. A group of neighbours gathers at the crossroads, cloaks pulled tight, staffs in hand, their boots crunching in unison as they set out along the icy road. You fall into step with them, your breath puffing in white bursts. Where are you headed? To a shrine? Because even when roads are treacherous and bellies are empty, faith insists on movement. A mainstream fact: pilgrimages were woven into medieval life, journeys of faith to local shrines or grand sites like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome. While long-distance pilgrimages usually waited for spring, shorter winter ones still happened, especially for Candlemas, St. Blaise's feast, or local saints whose relics promised healing or protection. You tread carefully, boots sliding on ice, and realize this journey isn't just about piety. It's about proving that even winter can't pin you down entirely. The road is bleak, flanked by skeletal trees scratching the sky. The snow crunches so loudly underfoot it feels like the earth itself is groaning. You glance at the figure beside you, an old man leaning on a staff, muttering prayers with every step. His lips are blue, but his eyes are determined. Pilgrimage, even a short one, is as much stubbornness as faith. Quirky tidbit: some pilgrims carried badges or tokens that doubled as proof of travel and protection. One man in your group shows you a lead badge shaped like a tiny boot, blessed at a shrine to St. James. He swears it keeps his feet from freezing. You raise an eyebrow at his frostbitten toes, but smile anyway. Joke 1. You think maybe the saint outsourced quality control that day. The shrine itself is small, a weathered wooden cross half buried in snow with a niche holding a faded image. of the Virgin. Someone has tied scraps of cloth to its post, prayers fluttering stiffly in the wind. A few candles flicker, their flames trembling as though unsure they should be alive out here. The group kneels, murmuring chants that rise like smoke. You bow your head, not because you're devout, but because silence here feels wrong. Historians still argue about whether winter pilgrimages were common acts of community or exceptions for the particularly devout. What's certain is that faith didn't vanish in winter, it only adapted. A short walk to a shrine might feel monumental when frost claws at your bones. And for people with little food or warmth, pilgrimage offered not only hope but also purpose. You sense that in the murmurs around you, in the way people cling to ritual like a lifeline. An old woman pulls out a flask and dribbles wine onto the snow as an offering. Another lays down a bit of wool. You search your pockets and find the onion you've been carrying since the beginning of winter, half shriveled but still pungent. With a grin, you set it at the shrine. The group chuckles softly. A holy onion. Surely God has seen stranger gifts. The priest raises his hand, blessing the group. His voice shakes in the cold, but the Latin words hang heavy in the air. Children fidget beside parents, stamping their feet, their noses red. When the prayers end, you all share what food you brought, mostly crusts and a thin flask of ale. It feels like communion, not in a church, but under the pale sky, the sacred woven into survival. On the road home, conversation warms the air more than cloaks. Stories ripple through the group. A tale of a man healed at Canterbury, a woman who saw visions on a road to Walsingham, a farmer who swore his fields grew twice as fast after leaving grain at a local saint's shrine. Skeptics murmur, believers nod fervently, but everyone listens because stories themselves are a kind of heat. Joke 2. You imagine saints keeping customer service logs. Complaint filed, wool offering did not improve sheep yield as promised. Your boots slip again, and you steady yourself on a neighbour's arm. That's another truth. Pilgrimages weren't solitary, they were shared struggles. You realise that without this group you'd probably have turned back long ago. Together, the icy road feels less hostile, more like a test everyone can pass if they lean on each other. By the time the village roofs come into sight, your legs ache and your stomach growls, but your heart feels oddly light. You've carried more than just yourself down that frozen road. You carried hope, faith, laughter, and even an onion. You set it down at a shrine and, in return, brought back something harder to name. As evening falls, you sit by the hearth, retelling the day to those who stayed behind. Children gape at the idea of candles burning outdoors. Adults nod at the mention of prayers, and someone teases you about giving up your onion. Joke 3. You sigh dramatically and declare it was your most tear-jerking donation yet. Faith doesn't warm your toes or fill your belly, but it does kindle something inside, a small glow that lasts even after the fire dies down, and in winter maybe that's the most powerful fuel of all. The glow of the shrine still lingers in your mind as the next morning drags you into a different kind of gathering, the market. If pilgrimages are journeys of faith, markets are pilgrimages of necessity, and today the square is alive with motion despite the frost. Stalls lean under the weight of snow, and traders stamp their feet, blowing into their hands as if breath alone could buy another hour of warmth. The smell of salted fish, smoky hides, and damp wool hangs in the air, a winter perfume nobody asked for. A mainstream fact. Medieval markets were lifelines, especially in winter when self-sufficiency cracked under scarcity. Peasants, townsfolk, and travelling merchants all met in these frozen hubs to barter grain, dried fish, salted pork, beans, onions, wool, and leather. Coin was scarce in villages, so barter dominated. Your extra skein of yarn for someone else's shriveled apples, your carved comb for their patch of dried peas. Today you clutch your little bundle of goods, rehearsing in your head how many apples your spindle work is worth. The first stall you pass reeks of salt. Wooden barrels brim with herring, their eyes clouded, their bodies stiff. Fish was the staple winter protein across much of Europe thanks to salting and smoking. You poke at one and almost chip your nail. It's as hard as wood. The vendor insists it'll soften nicely in pottage. You're not convinced. Joke 1. At this point, I could probably roof my hut with these herrings. Next, you wander to the produce stall. The sight is almost comical. A few withered apples, shrunken and wrinkled like old men who've seen too many winters, and a handful of root vegetables with more frostbite than flavour. Still, they're precious. Fresh produce in February is rarer than kindness from a tax collector. A woman haggles fiercely over 3 turnips, her voice sharp enough to cut ice. Quirky tidbit, medieval ça. Full markets sometimes employed criers or officials who monitored prices to prevent unfair profiteering, but in the cold months, enforcement often melted away. Historians still argue whether winter scarcity fostered more cooperation or more cutthroat behaviour. Judging by the elbows flying at the apple barrel, you're leaning toward the latter. You trade a comb for a string of onions and feel absurdly triumphant. The vendor eyes your handiwork suspiciously, muttering about whether bone cracks under frost. You shrug, knowing you've gotten the better deal this time. That's the charm of markets. Half commerce, half theatre. Every trade comes with posturing, complaints, and stories about how rare the item is. You hear one man claiming his sack of beans was blessed by St. Martin himself. Sure, if St. Martin was moonlighting as a bean farmer. Beyond the food stalls, the wool sellers have spread their goods. Rough cloaks, mittens, hose, all stiff with frost. One holds up a pair of gloves so patched they look more like a map than clothing. You finger the fabric, thinking of the hours spun in smoky huts, and respect settles in. Even scraps have value now. Joke 2. At this rate, my wardrobe's going to be 80% patch, 20% original cloth. The ale seller makes a modest appearance too, barrels tucked under canvas to slow the freeze. He ladles out mugs of thin, sour ale for coins or onions. You take one sip and wince. It tastes of desperation, but you drink anyway. The warmth in your throat outweighs the taste on your tongue. At the far end of the square, a money changer and a scribe set up under a sagging awning. Their services are rarities here. Recording contracts, weighing coins, notarizing trades. You watch a farmer sign away part of his next harvest in exchange for a sack of grain today. His hand shakes from cold or from fear, you can't tell. That's the sharp edge of winter markets, survival traded on tomorrow's hope. Historians still argue whether this practice of forward contracts bound peasants into deeper poverty or gave them essential lifelines. Either way, the farmer walks away with food for his children and his shoulders straighten. A commotion draws your eye. 2 men are shouting over a barrel of salted pork, each claiming it as theirs. A small crowd gathers, eager for drama. The steward steps in, weighing both men's arguments before splitting the meat down the middle. Justice by butcher's knife. Everyone nods, at least no one left empty-handed. By midday, your pouch of goods has thinned, your fingers are numb, but your bag is heavier with onions, apples, and a pinch of beans. You return to the hearth, stomach growling, and stew them slowly. The smell filling the hut. It's not luxury, but it's enough to lift spirits. As you eat, you reflect on the market's paradox. Scarcity makes everything feel precious, but it also sharpens human edges. Cooperation and competition exist side by side, woven together like wool threads. You survived another day not because there was plenty, but because you traded cleverly and argued boldly. Joke 3. You decide the real medieval superpower isn't swords, manship. It's haggling loudly enough to get 2 apples instead of 1. The pot empties, the fire dims, and you lie back, warm for the first time in days. Tomorrow hunger will rise again, and the market will groan under the same weight of need. But for tonight, your belly is steady, and you dream of a world where apples don't wrinkle and fish don't double as roofing tiles. By the time the next cold wave settles like a lead cloak over the valley, the river is no longer just a boundary, it's a floor. You step onto it with the same mixture of awe and suspicion you reserve for a bargain that sounds too good to be true. The ice answers with that faint musical groan you've learned not to fear, more orchestra than omen, so you shuffle farther, boots whispering over packed snow. And then the miracle reveals itself. Stalls, actual stalls. A ragtag marketplace has blossomed where boats once bobbed, and the river you tiptoed across last week has decided to throw a party. Straight ahead, a row of boards has been lashed to barrels and trestles to make counters. A woman in 3 shawls is selling hot chestnuts from an iron pan, the skins snapping like tiny fireworks. The smell coils through the air, warm and sweet, richer than any perfume you've known since autumn. Children sprint past on bone skates, wobbling, correcting, shrieking with delight when they skim a patch so smooth it might as well be a mirror. Somewhere a fiddler tries to keep his fingers from freezing while his tune skips along as cheerfully as a drunk sparrow. You grin despite yourself. The ice has not cracked, your gloom has. A mainstream fact to anchor the wonder in especially severe winters, famously in 1608 and 1683 to 84 on the Thames, rivers in parts of Europe froze so hard that frost fairs sprang up, complete with stalls, games, even printing presses that sold souvenir tickets printed on the ice. Earlier medieval freezes were less documented, but still turned waterways into temporary roads and ad hoc markets. When the world locks up, people invent doors. Today's door is a chestnut stall and a cluster of minstrels stamping time. You pass a table where a man is branding little wooden medals with a hot iron, crude hearts, stars, and the proud words "bought on the ice." The letter blur slightly where the iron hisses against sap. A girl holds up her prize like a saint's relic while her brother demands one that says "Wolf Scarer, Joke 1. You consider asking for Onion Defender certified, but the queue is long and your mouth is busy with chestnuts. A brewer has rigged a brazier over a barrel and is ladling out a steaming drink that smells of apples, spice and mischief. He calls it a flip, having plunged a red-hot poker into each cup until it froths like a little volcano. You wrap your hands around the mug and take a careful sip. Heat blooms across your tongue, then down your throat until it settles somewhere near your ribs and politely asks to stay. The brewer swears the poker also kills any river spirits. You decide it kills any lingering chill from last night's drafty hut. Quirky tidbit. A pair of lads has set up a goose slide, a ribbon of glare ice polished with fat where people take running starts and sail forward, arms pinwheeling, dignity optional. A painted board promises a prize for the farthest glide, a sugared bun the size of a fist. A woman in a patched red cloak launches and skims so far that everybody bursts into applause, including the priest, who then remembers himself and pretends to clap for safe sliding technique. Historians still argue whether such pop-up amusements were common in medieval village freezes or mostly a later urban flourish. Your bruised elbow votes for common enough today. You wander deeper into the fair. A butcher is turning a spit with meat that might be mutton or might be mystery with enthusiasm. The fat drips, spitting on the ice and making a little crater that sends everyone nearby yelping and skipping to keep their feet. The butcher slaps your shoulder and says it's good luck to eat roasted meat on the river, because then you've conquered 2 elements in one day. You buy a slice anyway, chewing while you watch a man carve names into the ice with an iron chisel. The river becomes a guest book, dates, initials, a crude heart. Yours will melt come spring, which somehow makes it more romantic. A printer, yes, an actual printer, has balanced a small press on planks braced with barrels. He inks a block with a care that borders on devotion and pulls a sheet, a crude woodcut of the frozen river, stalls, dances, the words "fair on the ice" looming like clouds. He's proudest of his boast that the paper was pressed upon the very ice itself, as though the river lent the ink a special sanctity. You buy one and tuck it under your cloak, already imagining it pinned above your hearth like a passport stamp the thaw can't wash away. Joke 2. You vow to start a collection right after you invent a wall that doesn't smoke. Not everything here is pure delight. The ice talks the whole time. Little sighs, sudden bangs that silence the fiddler mid-bow, the unsettling chirp of a crack racing outward, shallow but eager. People freeze in place, eyes wide, then exhale and shuffle back toward thicker, safer patches marked by brush. A rope stretches between poles as a guide. You stay close, and yet the hunger for merriment convinces everyone to come back again and again like moths with better footwear. You think about the practical miracle of this place. Trade that's been strangled by frozen roads finds a temporary artery across the river's locked back. Ale moves, wool moves, news moves. A man from 2 villages over insists there are onions for sale beyond the fiddler, and for a second your heart does something suspiciously like a jig. The fair isn't just a party, it's logistics with bells on. Historians still argue whether these fairs genuinely boosted winter economies or mostly burned scarce fuel in one gleeful blaze. Looking at the knots of barter, the stacks of yarn changing hands, the sudden availability of salt carried on sledges, you suspect it's both, commerce and catharsis braided together like a scarf. You strap on borrowed bone skates and push off with an enthusiasm that far outpaces your skill. The world glides, wind in your ears, cold slapping your cheeks, huts and hedges sliding sideways in a gentle, dizzy spin. For a breath, winter is weightless. Then your heel kisses a bumpling of refrozen footprints, and you execute what can only be described as a seated prayer. The children cheer your form. Joke 3. You declare the maneuver deliberate and call it the Pilgrim's Collapse. As the light thins, the fair glows more beautifully absurd. Torches bloom, their reflections look like coins scattered under glass. The fiddler's tune warms, picking up a drum that someone has magicked from nowhere. Couples turn slow circles, boots scraping time. Your mug of hot flip sends curls of steam that ribbon away on little breezes, and for the first time in weeks, your laugh comes out unguarded, as if it hasn't been rationed. You spot the wolf scarer medal again on the girl's cord. She winks at you, solemn and victorious. Somewhere nearby a crier calls, "Mind the cracks," and everyone laughs as if that warning were part of the music. Of course, you know this is borrowed time. The river keeps the ledger. When the thaw comes, sudden or sly, it will reclaim its face and its flow, and everything standing here will have to hurry ashore. That knowledge hangs lightly over the joy, not killing it, but sharpening it. You make your purchases, you eat your roast mystery, you skate your unholy figure eights because the ice has given you a room without a roof and invited you to dance in it today. On your way off the river, you pause, kneel, and press your palm flat to the ice, cold so clean it almost burns. You imagine the current lofting underneath, patient, biding, promising green shoots and mud and the reliably annoying splash of oars. The fair is the winter's best joke and its kindest gift, a market sprung from nowhere, laughter bottled in frost, proof that even in a season famous for taking, the world can be talked into giving a little back. You step onto the bank with your chestnut paper cone, your souvenir print, and a grin you didn't have this morning. The ice groans again, an old friend shooing you to safety. You promise to come running if it ever decides to throw another party. The echoes of laughter from the frost fair fade behind you, but the cold doesn't let go. By the time you trudge back into the village, the mood has shifted. The hearths burn low, the larders rattle hollow, and the smell of thin pottage lingers like a rumour you're tired of hearing. Hunger is no longer an inconvenience, it's a lodger that won't leave, tapping at your ribs with bony fingers. A mainstream fact, famine haunted medieval winters whenever harvests failed. Grain yields could be catastrophically low after wet summers or early frosts, and with little preservation technology, food simply ran out. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across Europe, sparked by cold and rain that ruined crops and livestock. You feel the echo of that history in every empty pot around you. The village storehouse, once stacked with sacks of oats and salted meat, is nearly bare. The steward doles out handfuls as carefully as a jeweler measuring gems. You line up with your neighbours, stomach growling loud enough to embarrass you and accept your share. A pitiful cup of grain. It's not enough to fill you, only enough to remind you of what's missing. You catch the eye of the woman behind you, clutching her infant. Her share looks even smaller. You both look away, ashamed of your calculations. Quirky tidbit. In hard times, people stretched bread with the strangest fillers. Bean flour, tree bark, ground ferns, even powdered bones. You hear someone whisper that a neighbour baked loaves with moss scraped off stones. The bread is green and spongy, more insult than meal, but it fills a belly for a night. Historians still argue whether these practices were common survival tactics or desperate exceptions preserved as cautionary tales. You hope it's the latter, though your jaw clenches imagining moss bread between your teeth. The hunger sharpens tempers. Two men fight in the square over a sack of peas, their fists clumsy from weakness but furious with fear. Children watch wide-eyed as their mothers pull them back, muttering prayers. Hunger turns neighbours into rivals. You hear whispers, who still has stores hidden under the floorboards, who slaughtered an animal in secret, who owes favours to the Lord. It's suspicion wrapped in frost. That night, families huddle around nearly empty pots. A broth of bones and cabbage stalks simmers weakly, more scent than substance. A boy licks the rim of the pot, desperate to taste what little clings there. You think of the frost fare's roasted chestnuts, and your stomach growls so loudly it startles the dog at your feet. Joke 1. You mutter that the dog's been eyeing you as supper anyway, so you're even. Stories surface of worse measures. In some villages, dogs and cats vanish. In the darkest corners, whispers of cannibalism creep like shadows. You don't want to believe it, but history records it plainly. There were winters so desperate that people turned on each other. You glance at your neighbour and instantly feel guilty for the thought that flickered through your mind. The famine doesn't just empty bellies, it empties trust. You pull your cloak tighter, trying to chase the hollow feeling gnawing your gut. Someone jokes bitterly that at least the lice are eating well this season. A laugh ripples through the hut, tired but real. Joke 2. You add that if the lice start charging rent, you'll have to move out of your own cloak. Humour is brittle, but it's something to bite on when there's no bread. Historians still argue whether communal sharing outweighed selfish hoarding in medieval famines. Some records describe neighbours pooling resources in church-led charity, while others recount brutal thefts and violent food riots. Looking around at your village, you see both possibilities simmering together. Tonight, people still share thin soup. Tomorrow, who knows? By dawn, frost clings to the thatch like a crown of thorns. You walk past barns, their doors barred, and wonder how many still hold anything edible. A cow lows weakly in one, ribs visible, eyes dull. Even livestock are starving, and you know what comes next. Animals slaughtered early, milk gone, spring fields left without plough beasts. Famine compounds itself like debt. That evening you sit by the hearth, stomach aching, head heavy. You stare at your onion badge still dangling from its cord. Once it was a charm, now you half wish you could eat it. Joke 3. You whisper to the pewter saint, if you can turn water into wine, how about this thing into stew? The hunger doesn't kill you tonight, it just makes you smaller, quieter, more careful with every crumb. You realize famine isn't a single event, it's a long shadow that grows each day the pot boils thinner. And though your ribs ache and your mind drifts toward desperate thoughts, you cling to one hope. Spring will come. It has to. Until then, you chew your crust slowly, pretending it's feast enough, and tell yourself the same thing every villager tells themselves in February: endure. The village is silent when you wake, not because it has died, but because even sound feels frozen. Then, as you push open the door, something new greets you, the faint patter of dripping water. At first, it's just a trickle from the eaves. Then it's a chorus, steady and insistent. The thaw has begun. The snow that seemed eternal is slumping in on itself, ridges collapsing into muddy rivulets. Icicles shiver and fall, shattering like glass on the ground. The air, though still sharp, carries a softness it hasn't had for months. You close your eyes and breathe it in. Wet earth, smoke, dung, the promise of something green beneath it all. A mainstream fact, medieval winters could stretch long into April in the worst years, but even then the thaw always came. Fields flooded with meltwater, roads turned to mud, and rivers roared back to life. The first weeks of spring weren't gentle. They were messy, swampy, and sometimes dangerous, but they meant the siege of winter was broken. Children are the first to celebrate. They dart outside, splashing through puddles, their laughter ringing louder than their coughs. A girl holds up a sprig of something pale and green, maybe early chickweed poking through the slush. It's not food enough for a meal, but it's proof that the ground remembers how to give. Parents smile weakly, as if that tiny weed were a banquet. You walk to the riverbank and watch ice slabs crack apart, drifting downstream like broken shields from a forgotten battle. The current gurgles, impatient, carrying away the season's silence. Quirky tidbit. Some villages held small festivals to welcome the waters back, tossing bread or flowers into the current as thanks. You imagine your onion offering floating downstream and grin. Joke 1. Saints, forgive me, but maybe the river wanted stew all along. But joy is tempered by scars. You hear coughing still, see faces thin, nearer than when the frost first set in. Granaries are hollow, livestock reduced, debts already tallying up in the steward's books. Spring offers hope, but not instant relief. Historians still argue whether communities truly celebrated the thaw or greeted it with weary pragmatism. Watching the mix of laughter and grim planning, you sense it was both. Neighbours gather in the square, voices buzzing with talk of planting. Oxen, if any survive the winter lean, will plough again. Seed saved at such cost will be scattered into mud. You hear someone joke that the fields are so hungry they'll eat the seed before it sprouts. Another answers that at least the saints don't tax mud. Joke 2. Give it time, the steward will find a way. Laughter rings out, tired, cracked but real. That night you sit by the hearth as rain taps on the roof instead of snow. It's still cold, but the fire feels less desperate now, more companion than master. You chew the last of your shriveled apples slowly, savouring the taste of survival. The thaw has not healed you, but it has lifted the heaviest stone from your chest. You stretch out on your straw pallet and think of everything endured. The frozen wells, the barley bread, the smoky huts, the lice, the wolves, the coughs, the feasts that vanished, the ale turned to slush, the markets of scarcity, the frost fairs, and the famine's long shadow. Each memory is a scar, but also a proof. You survived, and as the night deepens you smile faintly because you know tomorrow you'll wake not to frost but to mud, and mud, for all its mess, is the smell of beginnings. Joke 3. You mutter that medieval spring is basically free spa treatment, mud baths included. The siege is lifting, winter retreats, grumbling, leaving its claw marks behind. You pull your cloak tighter, not to fight the cold but to hug yourself in relief. Tomorrow will be filthy, wet, back-breaking, but tomorrow will also be spring. Now the story slows, like footsteps easing at the end of a long road. The fire in your hut glows softly, embers pulsing with a gentle rhythm, not fierce, not urgent, just steady. Outside, the thaw continues its quiet work, dripping from the eaves, whispering across the river, smoothing the hard edges winter carved so deeply. You let your breath fall into sync with those drips, slower, deeper, each inhale pulling the chill from your chest, each exhale releasing it back to the dark. The cold no longer feels like an enemy. It's fading, like a bad dream dissolving in morning light. You survived the frozen siege, and now the world is loosening its grip. The room is dim, shadows swaying with the last glow of the hearth. The state, raw beneath you, feels softer than before, as though the thaw has reached even here, warming the rough fibers into something more forgiving. You imagine green shoots pushing through mud outside, fragile but determined. Soon fields will hum again, rivers will sing, and children will chase one another without the sting of frost biting at their laughter. Let your shoulders sink lower, let your eyes rest heavier. The wolves are gone now, retreated into deeper woods. The hunger, though not forgotten, has passed its fiercest bite. What remains is the stillness after a storm, the quiet miracle of simply being here, breathing, listening, waiting for tomorrow's light. So let yourself drift. The medieval winter has finished its tale, leaving you with nothing but the hush of a fading fire and the soft hum of survival. Spring is near, and so is rest. Sleep now, knowing that every harsh night eventually melts into a gentler dawn.